When the Dwarves of Runenberg DLC for the last spell dropped, the new map, Runenberg, was pretty darn difficult. Recently, the developers have retooled it to make it a little bit more straightforward and have a bit more of a smooth difficulty curve. So today I thought it would be useful to go through how the map works, how it progresses, and ultimately what strategies I think are most effective for beating it. So if you're struggling with Runenberg, this is the video for you, and let's dive into it. First things first, what are we going to do? We're going to talk about the map structure itself, the features that the map has, the way they work, those types of things. Then we're going to go into a deep dive on the town build, how I would structure my town, where you should put things, those sorts of things. We'll talk about warp gates as well, as I think they're very important for Runenberg, and a few other miscellaneous build notes. Then we'll talk a bit about my recommended omens, what I think you should be running for beating Runenberg, what makes it easier, what are some things that are useful. Then we'll go through each night, what the different wave types are potentially, so what can spawn when. We'll talk about the specifics of the new boss fight, the new scheduling of the boss fight, and then do a bit of a strategic overview to wrap things up. Hopefully this will be a pretty quick video, so let's get right into the map itself. So this is the Runenberg map, and there's a few major features that I think make it somewhat unique and interesting as compared to some of the other maps. The first of them is the big red dots, aka line of sight. I think Runenberg is a map that is very much characterized by it being hard to see things, especially that southwestern side just has so many rocks and pillars. It is just incredibly difficult. The thing that is not mentioned here is also the Runestones, which we'll talk about more later, are additional line of sight impediments that you have to be able to see around or move around in order to kill the stuff behind them. So it is a map that challenges your line of sight. And on top of that, it is also a map that is rife with chasms. There are areas that you can jump over but not stand on all throughout the map. These have a huge influence on kind of the shaping of the waves of the map, but also your hero's ability to move where they need to move when they need to move there. So the combination of line of sight and chasms means that it is a map that pushes your vision as well as your mobility in being able to get to all of the places that you need to, because spoiler alert, you need to get to a fair number of places to get rid of all the corrupted runestones to get the map progressing, but we'll talk about that in a second. Just to do like a little bit of quick drawing, because I think it's somewhat useful. The map has some interesting characteristics. So the first that I wanted to point out is the bridge side, which is this side down here. And the thing that the bridge side has going on is that it always has a really high density of enemies when waves start here, because the surface area, aka this like space here, is really narrow, which means you're packing a lot of enemies potentially into a relatively small space. The same can be said for the northwestern side, because you have this very narrow channel here and this very narrow channel here. This means that sometimes you'll get some enemies here with a little bit of leakage over here or a little bit of leakage over on the side here, which both of those have some influence. We'll talk a little bit later, but a hero that is positioned here can't be doing work here and can't be doing work here particularly easily unless they have some type of vision granting skill and a lot of range. The other two sides, because of these large chasms, have somewhat curtailed space where enemies can spawn as well, right? So over here, you're really working from like here to here, but with a very natural funnel pulling things in. And then over here, similarly, the funnel means that you're really fighting enemies in this area and this enemy area here pretty straightforwardly. This map also has a relatively large haven. We're going to talk about the haven in a second, but you got a lot of room for activities here and a lot of space to fight enemies if you want to. But overall, I think it's a relatively interesting map. The other note is these chasms, like this one here, this one here, this here, this here. All of these are places where harpies are potentially going to be spawning, which adds a little bit of additional diversity to the way that the wave is going. But with that said, it's time to move on, and let's talk a bit about base building. Interactive base building is cut off there, but as a reminder, there'll be a link in the video description to my interactive base building guide, which is basically a little web app that I created that allows you to interactively go through the steps of the building process and get an idea of some recommended very compact builds that are going to maximize the space that you have in the Haven for fighting if you're going for something like ballista strats or corpse strategies. So this is the Haven as it starts off, and the things of note is that this inn here is doomed from the very beginning, especially if your first wave is coming in this way. You're just going to have a hard time keeping that alive. Similarly, this gold mine, very hard to preserve. The thing that I think is very interesting, though, is this house and this house, not as hard to preserve as you might expect. They have a surprising amount of plot armor that kind of protects them, and waves generally seem to filter past them without doing significant damage to them. This 4 ruin and this 4 ruin are a little harder, and actually this 4 ruin too. If you don't get to them relatively quickly, they're going to get eaten up by enemies, but it's not the end of the world. So let's talk a bit about how I would build this base. So this is my standard recommended build, and we'll go to a view that's a little easier to see. The only note that I would make here is that when I was making this, I went with gold mines. That is interchangeable with scav camps. I would recommend scavenger camps. I think materials are at a premium because this map is so short. But I like the idea of having the 2 gold mines flanking the shop, which you leave in its original position. And then you have plenty of space for your houses and your inn right here. Of note, this chasm line down the center makes it a little harder to make this a no-fly zone, but that's a side note. And then I do think that given the short nature of the map, the mana wells are still paying a lot of dividend. So let's see this in more grid view, just to make it really easily. Now we don't have all the 3D elements doing it. This is a feature of the website, by the way, is that you can swap to this view. You can swap between the 3D and the 3D grid view, which I think is terribly helpful. But this is the design with labels. So you have your scav camps, your shop, which I forgot to label, the inn, the mana wells, and the house. I think this is a really nice compact space. It gives you a ton of space for fighting enemies on every flank. Your walls don't end up interfering with any of the major chasm lines, which means that you have a really nice set of walls and everything is just quite nice. And you have this space here, which actually, if I go back to the previous screen for a second, this space here, fantastic for corpse farming. You put some type of durable tank right here, and enemies will just like feed in from the sides, and you can do a really good job getting some good corpse mountains there. But in a nutshell, I think this is the design that I advocate for. There's another optional design on the website that adds another scavenger camp. I think it might be a little greedy and a little expensive. I sometimes struggle to get the scavenger camps fully upgraded as a general rule of thumb. The last thing that people had previously requested that I didn't do as part of my base building guide, because that was very Haven specific, is where would you put your warp gates? And the short answer is that there are a lot of natural features on the map that do a decent job of protecting your warp gates. So I would highly recommend putting them in some of these configurations. The idea behind this warp gate is you have access to the runestones that spawn in this general area. This is another hotbed of runestones over here. You have a dwarf statue up here that can be hard to reach that this warp gate is going to be servicing. This warp gate, again, gives you access to this side while also picking up a runestone if it's over there. There'll be no runestones on this side, but you have a dwarf statue here, so having someone that can come cover the bridge, for lack of a better idea, is good. And then I've been warming up to this idea of having our final warp gate over here because it gives you access to some of the runestones that would be a little awkward to get from this space over here, while also giving you better coverage on this corner. I do neglect this side here a bit, but I generally feel like it's the least active. So that's the analysis on where the warp gates go, but I think this is a pretty good one. I like to have a warp gate near each one of the dwarf statues. You'll see this one services this one services this one services this, and this one services this. So let's talk about build, and this is hero build considerations. There isn't too much to say, but some high-level things. I think mobility is very important. Because the runestones are line-of-sight blockers, and you have stones that are line-of-sight blockers and dwarf statues, the dwarf statues, the boss statues, are not actually line-of-sight blockers, but there are other dwarven statues, that's so confusing, around the map that are also blocking line of sight. So being able to get around so that you can see around things is really important. Because of the way that corrupted runestones work, if you can't get to the point where you can see behind a runestone, it's very hard to clear it out, which can often cause you to have an elite boomer. Some builds to think about. I think momentum builds are very strong on this map. Having someone that can take 4 steps and then one-shot an elite boomer, it's just good for business. It's nice to have someone like that. It also means that you have someone that can run circles around things. I had a sword scepter momentum hero on a previous run, and they were able to service like 2 to 3 sides very comfortably in terms of taking out runestones and clearing everything out. The line of sight kind of like channels that are created make the gauntlet surprisingly useful, because you can use the propagate snare attack on the gauntlet along with Geo Reservoir being procced to get absolutely massive scope to be able to slow down enemies and kind of lock down a side that would otherwise be very difficult for your hero to traverse. Stun and Sadist are still strong. They are always strong builds, but I think that especially on the final night, there's kind of a lack of enemy density that can mean that like a multi-hit Sadist build can really struggle to pop off after having an incredibly strong run up until that point, because the mob density on the earlier nights is often very high. You'll see this when we go through the waves, but bounty hunters are incredibly prevalent on this map. And what that means is that glass cannon heroes can sometimes just get deleted. Because the bounty hunter's attacks reduce block, it is oftentimes very easy to underestimate how fragile your heroes are. You might have a dwarf that you're like, oh, they've been tanking okay. Get hit by a couple of bounty hunters, all of a sudden you're at 0 block and your hero just gets overrun. I've lost a fair number of heroes to 4 or 5 bounty hunters all charging up at the same time and just deleting someone. This is definitely a map that can 100 to 0 some of your heroes. And then the other piece of it on the flip side of it is tanky heroes have their own challenges too, because there are so many boomers potentially on this map, especially on the final night. And sometimes tanky heroes with a lot of point blank attacks can struggle with it. I would not generally recommend taking a bunch of elite boomer blasts to the face. It's relatively hard to build a hero that can shrug off elite boomers quite to the level that you might need to. So be wary of that. But generally speaking, I do think tanky heroes are pretty good. And there are potentially a ton of ranged enemies on this map, which means that perks like Berserk and Adrenaline Rush, to a lesser extent, Adrenaline Rush has its issues, but Spiky Counter, all of these things, Thickness, all of these skills that are like the more times you get hit, the more powerful you get, can really pop off on Runenberg. But generally speaking, vision and mobility, excellent things to have on lots of heroes. Let's talk about the Runestones for a second. I don't think we have to talk too much about them. This is an example of some Runestone spawns. The thing about Runestones is they are randomly generated at the start of the map. So what that means is the place where the Runestones show up is something that you can get familiar with on the first night of the map. And from that point forward, they will always be in the same places until you play the map again. That is also where the corrupted Runestones will show up, which are very important to track down. The Runestones are, as you can see, they blend in a little bit, but they're a little visually distinct. The corrupted Runestones now have an aura around them that makes them very easy to see. I should say an aura above them, but the Runestones take 3 forms. You have a poison runestone, an explosive runestone, and a chilling runestone. The base runestones all have 100 health, so they are relatively easy to pop, and when they do, they will do some type of AoE. The ice is a 5x5 with moderate damage. The poison is a 5x5 with 250 poison per turn. And the fire is a very large nuke in a 3x3 radius. The poison has no direct damage. As I mentioned, they are generated randomly per map start. and they will never spawn on the bridge side. The thing about Runestones, and I won't dwell too much on them because I do not think they're that transformative an element of the map, but they can be a nice pressure release valve. You let enemies come in, you're just like, I'm a little overwhelmed right now, and you pop a poison runestone, and most everything that was inside of it is probably dead immediately. You pop a frost runestone, and you just get like a turn of respite before you have to go back to the hard work, and occasionally you can pop a fire runestone and take a big chunk out of an elite. But long story short, I don't think runestones are game-changing. They can be handy from time to time. Let's talk about omens for the map. I have tried a bunch of different omens as part of all of my playthroughs. At this point, I have beat Runenberg on Apoc 6 with no ballistas. I've beat it. I nearly beat it with 2 heroes that became 1 hero. If I had had a warp crystal, I would have absolutely won, but we couldn't quite get there. So I've done a fair number of challenge runs, and I think I have a pretty good handle on some of the things that are most important. The first thing is advanced training, I think, is just an instant lock. Highly, highly recommend it. It just makes such a massive difference in getting higher rarity things like more multi-hit on your hero, more AP on your heroes. Really, really important. The next 2, I think of as interchangeable. When I'm doing a run, I'm going to pick one of 3 paths forward. Option 1 is I'm going ballista, and that's the most important thing. I will probably take siege and engineering and accept that my heroes will have a little less strength, but that will be offset by the fact that my base is going to have a lot of ability to project power. If I'm doing a no ballista run, I'll either take growth or talent. They have functionally very similar results. Talent is nice because it gives you a little more flexibility of builds because you have that extra perk to spend, whereas growth is going to give you more base stats because your heroes are going to be higher level by the end of the run. And then for the last 3 omen points that you have available to you, I recommend scavenging and bargaining, especially if you're going for corpse strats. I think it's really good. Bargaining is going to give you better sell prices. Scavenging is going to give you initially more materials and more gold from your corpse piles, and then later when you switch over to selling gear, bargaining is going to take over and kind of carry you the rest of the way. So it's a good way to get some good income. And then I think dexterity is always a beautiful thing to slot in there. I think 8 omens is a real sweet spot, if I'm being honest, because I think that this configuration works really well. And so here are 2 omen builds that I would recommend. Both of them start out with advanced training and dexterity. Then you have bargaining and scavenging. And in one case, I grabbed growth, which is the XP omen, and the other I grabbed siege and engineering to make my base a little bit stronger. But I think either of these will serve you very well. We like experience or things that accelerate the power of our heroes because the map is short and you don't have a lot of time. One of the things that was rebalanced with the map is that now there's more mob density, which does mean more experience. So it's not quite as essential that you take the experience omen, which is why I also suggest talent as another option. But this is still not going to be a map where you're going to have a bunch of like, level 18 fully decked out heroes. It goes by pretty quick. So let's talk about the wave compositions. I'm going to go through them each night by night, and then we'll finish with the boss night. These slides will get more interesting as we go. Night number 1 is pretty straightforward. There's only one option. It will always be claws and bats with exactly 1 bat. The bat usually comes pretty late in the wave, in my experience, but I think that may just be RNG. The elite bat can be challenging. You need to think a bit strategically about either slowing it down, say with a hand crossbow or a short bow or something like that, or being ready to really put in some damage once it gets into your haven. I think it's really important that you let that bat get into the haven so that you guarantee that elite corpse. Night number 2 has all that diversity that you're missing from night number 1. There are 2 things of note here. One is that only 1 out of the 6 options has an elite in it. So night number 2, you're probably not going to be dealing with an elite. If you are, lucky you. And the other thing is that you're going to see this distance option. So every time the developers create a wave type, they give it a name. So tanky, flying, distance, swarm, elite, buffer. The distance one is kind of the bane of your existence on this map from my perspective. There's a reason that bounty hunters are pink. There is the capacity most nights on this map to get bounty hunters, and when you do, you are definitely at increased risk of losing a hero. So my recommendation is be mindful of that. Night number 3, there are no elites possible at all, and you're always going to get Claws, Lancers, Dodgers, Splitters, Hoppers, Rippers, and Harplings. Harplings will show up on various nights. They always spawn out of the chasms. They're at times a bit of a handful. They hit very hard. They debuff your damage, and they do not count towards corpse piles. So kill them whenever you have the opportunity. Don't wait and mince words. Night number 4, you're always going to get 1 elite again, and you will always see Claws, Runners, Blockers, Bounty Hunters again, and Crawlers, which are the enhanced version of Runners. This night can be a little tough. Night 4 is one where there's a high density of Bounty Hunters, and if your head isn't on your shoulders, someone's going to poof. Night number 5, you're going to get 2 elites, and you're also going to be seeing Claws, Blockers, Kindles, Bounty Hunters again, Lancers, Rippers, and Harplings. The combination of Bounty Hunters and Harplings is kind of annoying. Having Rippers in here isn't too bad. I don't know if the elites... I don't think the elites always have to be Rippers. I think they could also be Lancers in this case, because it's just a tier 3 elite on this particular night. But this night can be a little bit challenging, but usually by this point, we have our defenses up and it's not too terrible. Night number 6, we're getting... are we getting elites? I wrote elites and then nothing else here. I don't think you get elites on night number 6, but this was a bit of an error. Don't sweat it one way or the other. But we have Flying, No Foot, Big Boy, Zoom Zoom, and Armored Core. I love the names for these things. Flying, you're going to be getting some Winged and some Accursed. No Foot, you're going to be getting Accursed, Twisted, Guardians, Harplings, and Claws. I think it's called No Foot because neither Accursed nor Twisted have feet, but I'm not sure. Big Boy is going to bring in your first opportunity, I think, to see bulkies. And then Zoom Zoom, you're just going to be swarmed by lots of Runners and the enhanced version of Runners. And then, of course, Armored Core. When you think of armor, what do you think of? Bounty Hunters? Question mark? No, you don't. But again, here there's a 1, 2, 3, 4. There's a 1 in 5 chance that you'll be blessed with Bounty Hunters on night number 6. Night number 7 is always the same. You're going to get 3 elites. You're also going to get Claws, Splitters, Crawlers, Boomers, Guardians, and Harplings. So lots of Boomers going into the final night as a general rule of thumb. The Guardians are whatever. I think this night is pretty straightforward and not too terribly difficult. So with that, you've completed the first 7 nights. I think if you're building Ballista, if you have a solid strategy for your base, if you're recruiting heroes relatively late, you can push off recruiting for quite a while until you're maybe like level 8 or something like that. The pre-nights are not that difficult. You never really get that full surround UG feeling. Now onto the boss though, and the boss has changed quite drastically. I think this is the most important thing to know about the boss. This is the optimal schedule for the boss. Night number 1, you're going to get 1 runestone. Night number 2, you're going to get 2 runestones. Night number 3, nothing. Night number 4, 4 runestones. And when you kill that runestone, you will get 1 of the dwarf statues on night 5 to kill. On night 6, you'll get 5 runestones. Killing those 5 runestones on the next night, night 7, will unlock 2 dwarf statues. And then on night 8, you will get 5 runestones and the last dwarf statue. The thing to note is starting at night 4, if on any night you fail to kill all the things listed in the gray box, aka you don't kill the 4 runestones, you don't kill the dwarf statue, you don't kill the 5 runestones, you don't kill the 2 dwarf statues, it will delay your victory by 1 night. And what that means is you're going to have a lot more pressure on your base, a lot more enemies are going to be reaching you. In terms of killing these things, the Corrupted Runestones have 700 hit points, and the Dwarf Statues come in 2 variants as far as I can tell. One is 7,440 hit points and 50% resist, and the other one is 6,840 hit points, 800 armor, and 20% resist. These are APOC 5 numbers, so assume that they will be reduced by the 30% that APOC 2, I think, increases it by. But generally speaking, the Corrupted Runestones are surprisingly tanky, in my experience. They always take a little more work to kill than I expect them to. And then the Dwarf Statues, you just need some heavy hitters. Having some magic damage to get through that resistance can be really important, or just some resistance reduction, and both of them feel about similarly tanky in my experience. So how does this all work? The corrupted runestones have a feature that you need to be aware of. The first time it happened to me, I was like, oh, that's a thing that happens. So they have a radius, I believe 3 diamond around them. And if when they are destroyed, there is any enemy other than an elite boomer around them, they will convert that enemy to an elite boomer. So what this means is that you want to ideally clear around them so that you don't end up inundating yourself with elite boomers. My recommendation is for the first maybe 2 to 3 dwarf, well, the 3 dwarf statues. So for the first 2 rounds of runestones, the round of 4 and the round of 5, here we can go back. So I'm talking about night 4 and night 6. I would recommend clearing around the runestones if possible, so that you don't spawn a lot of boomers. And if you do, have a good plan for how to neutralize them. Some with slow death, whatever it happens to be, just something to slow them down. Then the final night, just don't worry about it. Spawn the boomers. They'll never make it to your base as long as you kill the dwarf statue in a timely fashion, excuse me. So in terms of the boss behavior, there are 2 options for what the dwarf statues will do every turn. And they do this regardless of whether they are active or not. So from the very beginning of the night, they will be doing actions. They will be doing one of 2 things. Option number 1 is a point blank diamond shaped buff around them. They will either buff the damage and resistance of the enemies or the armor and move of the enemies. It's interesting because in the screenshot that's animating, it shows, I believe, damage and move, which makes me wonder if maybe it picks 2 at random of these 4, and sometimes it will be armor and resistance, sometimes it will be damage and move. I don't actually know. The 2 that I could see in the footage that I looked at were damage and resistance and armor and move, and that's the way that I've been thinking about them. Grand scheme of things, it doesn't matter too terribly much. You just need to be mindful of the fact that potentially enemies are going to be hitting harder because they have a damage buff. The second action that they can do is a long-range nuke focused on one of your heroes that does moderate damage in a 5x5 area. It's enough to do some serious damage to walls and to destroy ballistas, and it also comes with a minus 20% debuff, which makes stability potions and health potions have an additional bit of use. Finally, though, when one of the statues becomes active, so you've killed all the runestones and the statue becomes active and vulnerable, it will enrage and it will do 2 of these actions because it is energized rather than just 1. So you can get a double buff, which can be pretty scary because it can mean that some of the enemies around the statue all of a sudden have 120% damage and 40% resist, which can be pretty spicy. But generally speaking, once they become vulnerable, you go over, you knock them down, and they stop bothering you for the rest of the run. So just as some parting thoughts, I think I really like where Runenberg is. I think before Runenberg was very challenging. It was fun to play the previous version because it was difficult, but I think they've done a really good job tuning it. It is not too easy. It has some good feel to it. The pressure is still there. There's still some gauntlet to it. But here are maybe 8 things that I think should be on someone's list who is struggling with Runenberg. First of all, production, I do not recommend it. The map is too short. It punishes production because you don't have much time to enjoy the fruits of your labors. And you also end up building a bigger base, which gives you less space to fight. So to no one's surprise, I think corpse strats are king here. Those mountains of corpses are the best form of income you're going to get, and you want to be converting them around night 4-ish. You want to start converting over to pulling gear out so that your heroes get nicely geared, and then using the gold from selling the surplus gear to start recruiting heroes from your inn. I think scavenger camps are better than gold mines because they give you an additional way to offset the fact that on night 4, when you start taking gold rather than materials from the corpse mountains, your materials quantity is going to fall off and the number of ballistas you can get are going to reduce. So scav camps help you keep that process going so you can get to around 30 ballistas by the end of the run. My personal approach is to put off hero recruitment until around level 8 so that the heroes that you're recruiting from the inn are expensive, but they come mostly fully formed so that you can kind of get them up and operational. And once your heroes hit level 8, I'm pretty much recruiting a hero every night until I've hit 6 most of the time. But if you find that you're really stretched thin, 5 heroes with good gear is definitely better than 6 heroes with one of them having like garbage gear. So prioritize your gear, but if you have the surplus to be able to get that 6 hero, it's always a good idea because you're spread to a lot of locations trying to take out those corrupted runestones. XP perks and talents help a lot with getting your heroes to those thresholds sooner so that you can start recruiting. Bounty hunters are everywhere on this map. I think it's a real challenge of this map, and it is very easy to lose heroes and end up behind the gun. I did a challenge where I was going for only the heroes that I initially started with. I wasn't going to build an inn at all. And I lost a hero, I think on night number 2 to bounty hunters. And then I lost my second hero to an elite boomer on the final night, on like the first turn. It was pretty comical. But generally speaking, losing heroes is bad. It's expensive, and I would highly recommend being very vigilant on this map about making sure that your heroes are safe, not only from being meleeed by enemies, but also from being shot by them. It's never a bad idea to run away from a powered up bounty hunter. If you get more than 10 tiles from where they're going to end up, they won't shoot you. And then last but not least, the 2 houses on the flanks of Runenberg have this weird plot armor, so you can hang on to them for a long time. Don't upgrade them. They will eventually get destroyed, but you can leave them for a fairly long time. And the cost to move a house and upgrade it once is the exact same as the cost to do the second upgrade on a house. So you should build your 2 other houses in your base, upgrade them fully, and then only when you start to have more corpse mountains and elite corpses than you have workers should you start destroying and relocating your remaining houses. If you do all these things, remain vigilant and keep on schedule with the boss. That's the most important thing with the boss, is if you start falling behind, those additional turns in that night are going to kick your butt. But if you do all those things, I think Runenberg is a very enjoyable level of challenge. It feels good. It feels a little short. That's really my only complaint. But overall, I think it's a fun map. And I think that if you implement some of the strategies that I've outlined here, you'll probably find yourself getting wins pretty handily. So that's it for me and Runenberg. I hope this guide was helpful. Let me know in the comments if there was something else you wanted to see in this strategy guide or something else that you were curious about. If you want to see more details about my interactive base building guide, find it in a link in the video description. And I am working on my build guide for my builds 2.0. Very excited about that. I currently have a Google form where you can go submit a build if you are curious. So look for that in the video description as well. But that's it for me. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye.